It has been shown that it's actually caffeine itself, is because 90% of adults. Let's talk for a moment about when to avoid caffeine. And in the same stroke, let's also talk about some of the myths around caffeine. For instance, one of the major myths around caffeine is that it can increase osteoporosis. Turns out that while there is a relationship, of course, between calcium and osteoporosis, that is reductions in bone density, and it is the case that caffeine can extract calcium from certain tissues, the large-scale studies that are out there essentially prove that if people are ingesting enough calcium through their diet, which most everybody is, although certainly there are some people that need to supplement calcium or make it a point to consume more calcium-containing foods. But assuming that you are getting adequate levels of calcium, there is no direct relationship between caffeine intake and osteoporosis, at least not that I'm aware of. I know this was debated for a number of years in the literature, but the literature seems to have arrived at a general consensus now that caffeine itself is not going to create or exacerbate osteoporosis, provided people are getting enough calcium through their diet, that is through foods, through supplementation, or both. Some of the other myths around caffeine are that, for instance, caffeine will reduce testosterone levels or will reduce estrogen levels. Other myths out there are an exact opposite to that caffeine will increase testosterone levels, in particular free testosterone levels. There have been some large-scale studies addressing the hormone effects of caffeine. They are a little bit difficult to do. I should just mention that caveat. And the reason they are difficult to do is because 90% of adults are consuming caffeine. And therefore, you can imagine, it's very hard to find a control group to compare the caffeine consumers to. In particular, a control group that's well controlled for other things like lifestyle, diet, exercise, etc. However, when one controls as well as one can for all the various factors that could impact hormones, what one discovers is that caffeine intake, at least at the dosages we talked about earlier, 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, or even up to double that there are no consistent increases or reductions in testosterone or estrogen in men or women that can be directly attributed to the caffeine intake. And I say directly attributed because in these association studies, one always has to wonder, for instance, if because people are ingesting more caffeine, they have more energy and therefore are exercising more, and exercise is known to have effects on testosterone, estrogen, and other hormones, whether or not the effects of caffeine on those hormones is indirect, and so on and so forth. And this all just underscores the challenges of doing studies on humans in the wild, in their natural habitat of living, as opposed to an acute study, as it's called, of bringing someone into the laboratory and studying them just for those hours or moments. With all that said, there does appear to be a relationship between caffeine intake and so-called sex hormone and binding globulin, which is a protein present in the body of both men and women that binds to the sex steroid hormones, testosterone and estrogen, and prevents them from being in their free or active form. It has been shown that ingestion of caffeine, even in the sorts of dosage ranges that are considered safe and that we've been discussing, can increase sex hormone binding globulin such that it can slightly reduce overall levels of free testosterone and free estradiol in women. Now, those effects are relatively minor, but they do exist. If any of you are interested in reading further into the effects of caffeine on hormones, I'll just refer you to a couple of studies. We will link to this in the show note caption. The title of the study is Consumption of Caffeinated Beverages and Serum Concentrations of Sex Steroid Hormones in U.S. Men. And within this study, there's a reference to a equally sized and powered study done on women, both of which converged on the same conclusion by examining more than 1,000, so in this case 1,410 men, or more than 1,000 women, that there are increases in sex hormone binding globulin associated with increased intake of coffee in particular. But they were able to narrow that down specifically to ingestion of caffeine. So it's not coffee per se that's causing the increase in sex hormone binding globulin, it's actually caffeine itself. Now, again, the increases in sex hormone binding globulin were not so significant that, at least to my mind, they seem like a concern. Although I think that it is worth noting that if you're going to consume caffeine, that you probably want to consume caffeine in a way that is in dosages and with the sort of timing that will allow you to get away with ingesting caffeine, but not to excess. So to derive the benefits of caffeine without, for instance, driving up sex hormone binding globulin too far. Now, why would that be a good idea? Why would you want to make sure that you have enough free testosterone and free estrogen? Well, some of that is related to the acute effects of those hormones in terms of well-being and libido and strength and mood, etc. But some of it is also related to the longer-term effects of sex steroid hormones. Many people don't realize this, but the sex steroid hormones operate on the receptors at the surface of cells to have immediate effects, but they also can enter cells and actually go into the nucleus of cells where the DNA of those cells are contained and control gene expression in those cells. So the sex steroid hormones, testosterone and estrogen, are controlling a lot of different cellular functions over long periods of time. So blunting their action over long periods of time is probably not a great idea. But again, at the dosages of caffeine that we're talking about today, 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, unlikely that the increases in sex hormone binding globulin that one experiences from that are going to be detrimental. And certainly the positive effects of caffeine that one experiences in terms of mental performance and physical performance, and the fact that it increases energy to do the sorts of things like exercise that we know can profoundly improve hormone profiles, right? Twofold or threefold improvement in hormone profiles. In that case, it seems that ingesting caffeine is overall a good thing, provided it's not in excess. That also makes this the appropriate time to mention one of the more impressive effects of caffeine, which is on overall levels of mood and mental health. There are several studies on this, but the one that I'm particularly fond of was published in 2019 in Psychiatry Research, and the title of the paper is Inverse Association Between Caffeine Intake and Depressive Symptoms in U.S. Adults. And these are data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And the basic takeaway is that while, of course, there are a ton of different factors that are going to relate to whether or not people are depressed or not, life circumstances, genetics, and so on, that, and here I'm quoting from the study, caffeine's psychostimulant properties, that just means the ability to make us feel more alert and positive, appear to protect against depressive symptoms. And of course, they acknowledge that additional studies are needed, but this is just one of several studies pointing to the fact that people who regularly ingest caffeine in the appropriate dosages do seem to enjoy an antidepressive effect overall. I wouldn't want anyone to consider caffeine a treatment for severe depression, or at least not alone a treatment for severe depression, but provided the anxiety-inducing effects of caffeine can be kept in check through use of theanine or making sure that the dosage and the timing of caffeine ingestion is correct, then caffeine overall seems to be good for our mood and prevent depression, or at least keep depression at bay when depression might otherwise surface or be more severe.